Good morning students. Today I am going to discuss about the acid properties of transactions. In the field of relational database management systems, there are some properties recommended which a transaction must fulfill. These properties are referred to as the acid properties. The full form of acid is atomicity, consistency, isolation, and durability. You will understand each of these properties in detail from the next slide. The first of the acid properties of a transaction is the atomicity. According to this property, once a transaction has started, it must be completed in its entirety or else should not start at all. If for any reason an error occurs and the transaction is unable to complete all of its steps, then the system is returned to the state it was in before the transaction was started. That means once a transaction has started, it should execute all of its steps in entirety or else should not execute at all. But in the event of an error, the transaction should stop immediately and it should roll back to the state before it was started. And that is all about atomicity. In the next slide, I will explain this property called atomicity with the help of an example. Consider the transaction as shown in this slide. This transaction consists of two SQL statements. The first one is the insert into order statement, which inserts a particular record into the orders table, and the second one is the update item statement, which updates a particular record in the items table. Now, for this transaction to fulfill the property of atomicity, both these SQL statements should run in its entirety and execute successfully. Once this transaction runs in its entirety and execute the SQL statements successfully, the changes will be made in the database permanently with the help of the commit statement at the end of the transaction. So, this commit statement applies the changes to the database permanently once this transaction has run in its entirety and executed successfully. But in the event of an error, the transaction will stop in the middle of its execution and it will roll back to a state before it has started the transaction. In this slide, I will be explaining you about the second property of a transaction, that is consistency. Consistency ensures that after every transaction, the data in the database is in a stable or a consistent state as it was before the transaction. That means once a transaction has run in its entirety and completed its execution successfully, the changes will be made reflected in the database permanently and the database will be in a steady or a consistent state just as how it was before the transaction. Again, in the event of an error, the transaction will roll back to a state before it has started where it was consistent. Thus, the second property of a transaction ensures that the data in the database is in a consistent state before and after a transaction under any circumstances. Consider the transaction as shown in this slide. The data in the database will remain in its consistent state before as well as after the execution of this transaction. As a result, it fulfills the property of consistency.